Over the past couple years, more Americans have become familiar with the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre, where a white mob burned a vibrant black community to the ground, which is crazy. Even crazier, dozens of other black towns have been erased off the American map, not by burning them down but by hiding them underwater. Don't know what I mean? Well, let's find out. Beneath the placid surface of American lakes and reservoirs lies a story whispered not by rustling leaves or lapping waves, but by the silent ghosts of history. Deep within their watery embrace slumber overarmed black towns, once vibrant communities that pulsed with the dreams and aspirations of their inhabitants. They weren't swallowed by natural upheavals, no, their submergence was orchestrated by a different force, a human tide fueled by a complex murky tide of racial prejudice and progress. There's a long history of development-induced displacement that forced black people to leave their homes, and most of them weren't paid or were undercompensated. Homes, roads, buildings, and even graves submerged, thousands and thousands of acres flooded, shelters and livelihood ruined in an instant to create power and recreational sources. If we've learned one thing today, it's never assume something is unsinkable. There are over 100 drowned American towns, and many were destroyed in the name of something called development-induced displacement. That's when people have to leave their homes so the government can develop things like dams or parks or lakes. This happens to both white and black people, but historically when it happens, black people and other people of color are undercompensated for their property or not compensated at all. Elba Woods, North Dakota; Kennett, California; Enfield, Massachusetts; Nevesin, New York; Butler, Tennessee; St. Thomas, Nevada, and many more. Each of these towns represents a different element of America's development, yet they all share the same fate. They and hundreds of other communities like them were vacated, demolished, and flooded to make way for dams and reservoirs. Their remnants persist, preserved underwater, and sometimes emerge as reminders of what was not allowed to be. Welcome to yet another touching video segment here today. This time we are taking a dive at black towns that were once upon a time drowned by whites. Don't forget to acknowledge our works by hitting that like button on your screen. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening information, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support means a lot to us. Lake Liner is a popular weekend destination known for fishing, boating, and so much more, including an eerie reputation that has deemed it as haunted in Georgia. But one lesser-known fact is the lake sits on top of the black town Oscarville. Oscarville was a thriving black community filled with carpenters, blacksmiths, bricklayers, and more. Out of all the trades in the town, farming was number one. Around 1912 there were over 1,000 black residents in Fawsey County, and only 58 were landowners. According to the Digital Library of Georgia, there were 109 black residents paying farm tax. The farm tax had to be paid by anyone that rented or owned a farm. P.S. Grant Smith and Levi Greenlee Jr. were the spiritual leaders of the community and helped keep everyone together. Records from Greenlee's church showed that picnics were organized often for churchgoers. However, violence towards black people in this town began shortly after a few black men were accused of raping and killing a white woman. Rob Edwards was arrested in September 1912 along with Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel, both teenagers, all accused of raping and murdering a young white woman named Mae Crow. Edwards was dragged out of jail by white mobs and beaten with a crowbar and then lynched from a telephone pole in the town square for everyone to see. Daniel and Knox went to trial and were found guilty on the same day. The boys were sentenced to death by hanging. Violence continued towards Oscarville, GA, with residents being threatened, homes shot up and burned. This led to black landowners selling their property for way less than they paid for it, like Alex Hunter, who bought a farm during 1912 for $1,500. When Alex sold the land, he only received $550. Land was also taken from residents through the adverse possession legal process after being abandoned for too long. According to Georgia historian Elliot Jaspin, only 24 black land owners in Faury County were able to sell their land, and the rest have no record of sale. It's safe to say the remaining land was stolen. Years later, during 1956, the U.S. government gained the rights to more than 56,000 acres of land in Forsyth, Hall, and Dawson counties to make room for a 38,000-acre lake plus about 700 miles of shoreline. That lake is known today as Lake Lena and covers the town of Oscarville. Lake Lena provides water to the metro Atlanta area and attracts over 10 million visitors each year. On quiet evenings, visitors sometimes hear the ghostly chimes of church bells rising from the depths of Lake Martin. At other times, the eerie banging of hounds echoes across the waters, said to be the spirits of hunting dogs whose graves were never moved before the dam was built and the farmlands flooded. Here's one quick one on Koala. John Benson began buying land in 1880. And by 1898 he owned 3,000 acres of land. He eventually built a farmhouse, a brickyard, a sawmill, a cotton gin, and a compression mill on this land. This led to the community of Korea being formed together, where over 40 families produced corn, cotton, sugar, wood, and more due to his wealth. John Benson was able to become the local bank. Yes, one man was the local bank. He began backing mortgages for black people and even loaning money to white people. John's son, William Benson, was born into wealth in 1873, and his legacy began that year after college. William wanted to provide education to the people of Korea, so he came up with a plan to build a school in the community. He believed that by teaching the residents how to read, build moral character, and even learn industrial skills, the community would be held to a higher standard. John Benson liked the plan and gave William 10 acres of land to that effect. In 1898 the Koala Academic and Industrial Institute was incorporated. The school provided education to black children for nearly 40 years. After opening, the Board of Trustees had well-known individuals like Booker T. Washington and Oscar Garrison Villard. The school wasn't enough for William, as he wanted even more for his people. He eventually came up with the idea of building a railroad after realizing that most farmers were out of work for 6 months out of the year. During 1900 he purchased 540 acres at $4.25 per acre on consideration of $7,500 in stock from his father. After the purchase he founded the Dixie Industrial Company, then began producing lumber and processed cotton. At one point the sawmill produced 50,000 feet of lumber per day while grossing $30,000 per year. The company also operated as a local bank, similar to John Benson's railroad plans that came to life in 1904 when he founded the Dixie Line. This was the first black-owned railroad company in the United States. The railroad company had customers all over the world but was short-lived because of World War I. The railroad was dismantled by the Alabama Power Company during 1922, just a few months before plans for a 44,000-acre reservoir were revealed in 1923. When construction was complete in 1926, the Koala Academic and Industrial Institute closed their doors for good. A large portion of the institute and industrial properties were acquired by Benjamin Russell. One can't be sure how the Alabama Power Company mysteriously managed to get all the land needed for the dam to be built, but it's safe to say the land was stolen or sold for way less than what it was worth today. Lake Martin is used to generate hydroelectric power for the Alabama Power Company and covers what was once home to a thriving black community dating back to 1821. The state of New York required black men to own over $250 in land and live there for at least 3 years in order to vote, so owning land was a big deal back then. Seneca Village was a community formed by John and Elizabeth Whitehead during 1825. The couple divided their land into 200 lots and began selling them. The first 3 lots were sold to Andrew Williams for $125. Epiphany Davis bought 12 lots for $578. The Zion Church bought 6 lots for an undisclosed amount. Between 1825 to 1832 the Whiteheads sold half of their land to other black people. By 1830 there were 10 homes in the village and livestock being raised. A spring known as Tanner Spring provided water to the village. By the 1950s, there were 50 homes in the village, 3 churches, a cemetery and a school for black kids. Compared to the other black people living in New York, the residents of Seneca Village were more stable. By 1855 half of Seneca Village residents owned their land. During 1857 the city of New York used eminent domain to seize the land and displace over 1,600 residents. Construction began shortly after, and the park known as Central Park took the place of an important black community. Susanna, or Susanna, was also flooded by Lake Martin. The town of Susanna had a post office, bank, gold mine, school, a grist mill, a flour mill, a sawmill, a blacksmith shop, a church and more. During 1916, Alabama Power Company began acquiring the rights to land in efforts to make room for the 168-foot-high dam they planned on building. This dam covers over 40,000 acres. Today, hundreds of families were displaced because of Lake Martin, and 12 cemeteries containing 923 graves were relocated in the 1940s. Vanport was the center of a booming shipyard industry because of World War II and quickly became the second largest city in the state, but as World War II saw white males drafted to serve overseas, a labor shortage pulled in a great migration of blacks from the South, with soldiers being drafted overseas to fight in the war. Oregon saw a labor shortage. This resulted in a great migration of black Americans from the South. These new workers needed places to live, as the Albemarle neighborhood was the only place where black people could live legally. It became too small for the growing population of black Americans, and Vanport was built as a temporary housing solution. At its peak, 40,000 residents, or 40%, were African American, but then in 1948 massive flooding erupted in the neighborhood and city officials didn't warn residents of the dangerously high water levels. Many didn't evacuate in time. The town was wiped out. Within a day, 18,500 families were displaced, more than a third black American today. That area is known as Delta Park. The rising waters of the Garrison Dam that created Lake Sakaka not only swallowed up farm and ranch land, but also several North Dakota cities were lost to the Big Lake's water. According to an article in Prairie Public Newsroom, it was a sad outcome for many North Dakota families who were forced to move and displace because of this new reservoir that was created for flood control and hydroelectric power. Lake Sakaka was completed back in 1956 in North Dakota. It is the second largest man-made lake by area in the United States. Now, Lake Sakaka is a mecca for water recreation, but there was a time when its floors were towns with schools, hospitals, and stores. In many of these towns, people were displaced members of the Fort Berald Indian Reservation. Most of them were moved to what is now the city of Newtown. Woods Red but Lucky Mound, Nishu, Beaver Creek, Independence, Shell Creek, and Charging Eagle are 8 towns in North Dakota that now lie in massive amounts of water that we now call Lake Sakakaka. So next time you're up on the Big Lake for a weekend of fun, take a moment and remember all the history that surrounds you. Elbow Woods, a town, an area along the Missouri River known for its distinctive horseshoe bend, hence the name Elbow Woods, was one of several Native American towns along the Missouri River that were permanently flooded following the completion of the Garrison Dam in North Dakota. When the Garrison Dam was completed in 1953, the water ERS of the Missouri River behind it began to rise as Lake Sakaka formed hundreds of thousands of acres of fertile land that were submerged, named after Sokajaya, the legendary Shawnee Indian woman who guided Lewis and Clark through the mountains of Montana. Lake Sakaka ISL is the second largest man-made lake by area and the third largest by volume, according to its creator. The Garrison Dam is the nation's 5th largest earthen dam. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built this massive dam for flood control, hydropower generation, and irrigation. One of the most important towns on the Fort Berald Reservation fell victim to Lake Sakaka waters. Elbow Woods, founded in 1891, served as the central town for the 3 tribes, containing the central business community and the local tribe headquarters. It was home to gas stations, stores, a post office, and other businesses, as well as the reservation's main school and only hospital. The construction of the dam created a vast reservoir stretching over 178 miles, encompassing much of the land previously occupied by Elbow Woods and other nearby communities. The creation of Lake Sakaka, 200 m long, flooded a quarter of the Fort Berald Indian Reservation, forcing the relocation of 325 families and nearly 80% of the population on the reservation at that time, displacing residents, agricultural land, and Seba historical sites, including parts of the Louis and Clark Trail. Many moved it to a newly established community called Newtown, so while Elbow Woods itself isn't technically a lake, its location now lies deep within the waters of Lake Sakakaka. Forever part of its submerged history, though the old mining town of Kennett was a faded relic of its boomtown self by the time it was flooded by Lake Shasta in 1944, it was still home to 100 people. Like other gold rush towns in Northern California, it was established for mining and prospecting in the region in the 1850s, though it wasn't until a railroad camp was built in 1883 with over 1,000 Chinese laborers that the population began to rise substantially. Gold was discovered nearby the next year and a post office came in 1886. The largest copper smelter on the west coast opened in 1905, and by 1911 3,000 people lived in town. The hills around the town were exfoliated and duded by the acid fumes from the smelter, and farmers in the valley 15 miles away began a sweat against the company that operated the smelter for destruction of their crops. The mines closed after the end of World War I. The smelter soon followed, and Ket's population fell over the next 2 decades. The town now rests beneath 400 feet of water, along with many of the region's smelters, paint factories and mines, and their surrounding despoiled soils. Nevesin, whose fateful name is said to be derived from the Indian word Neasin meaning continuously flowing, was the larger of 2 communities that were removed from the reservoir site in 1942. The other town was called Bittersweet. A total of 340 people were evicted from the valley, and 6,149 acres condemned. Some buildings were relocated to nearby towns, though most were bulldozed and burned in a final harvest. Trees were removed, cellars were filled in, privies disinfected, and even barnyard manure was said to have been dug up to maintain New York City's reputation for having the finest quality drinking water possible. The Neversink Reservoir began to flood the land on June 4, 1953, and took 2 years to fill. The scenic New England villages of Dana, Prescott, Greenwich, and Enfield were disincorporated on the same day, April 28, 1938. Over the next year, the valley was demolished and deforested by over 1,000 woodpeckers and immigrant workers from Boston, who at times ran amok in the doomed landscape, living in the vacated houses along the main streets and burning churches without authorization. Some of the old buildings were moved to other towns, but most were bulldozed into piles and burned, as was 30 square miles of forest. The valley was on fire for months, and in all, 2,500 people were relocated. 7,000 bodies from local cemeteries were reinterred on higher ground. The Quinn finished filling in 1946. It has no flood control, electrical generation, or navigation functions. It was built for one purpose only: to serve the drinking water needs of Boston. 60 miles away, still called the largest single-purpose reservoir in the nation, it is the city's primary water source. Butler was the largest single community and the only incorporation town removed by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Throughout that entire massive Depression-era public works project to modernize and electrify the rural parts of 7 southeastern United States, Butler was the commercial center for the Watauga Valley in eastern Tennessee and the only real town in the region with a population of around 600. It was a typical southern town with 2 barber shops, 2 beauty parlors, markets, the Bluebird Cafe hardware store, drugstore, a few service stations, and a few hotels. 3 churches and a rail station, Masonic Lod, a brick city hall, bank, and doctors' and dentists' offices located in the forested hills of Appalachia. Local industries were mostly wood-related and included a lumber company, a cading company, a furniture company, and a casket company. In 1948, when the floodgates were closed, the water dam and reservoir began flooding 458 square miles along the Water River. 735 families had been displaced. Around 175 buildings including shops, barns, churches and homes were moved to higher ground to a new town site named New. Most buildings were demolished on site and 1,200 bodies were moved from the graveyard. Some families opted to leave the graves of their ancestors undisturbed, so they are still there, along with a reported slave graveyard that TVA crews never found. When Old Butler was exposed in the 1983 drawdown conducted to service the dam, Don Stout shoe store made of stone and the one-room jail Hussey made of concrete stood out from the other foundations, and building paths along muddy streets still lined with trees long dead but preserved by the water. Like most of the early settlements in the desert southwest, St. Thomas was established in an area of available water, in this case the comparatively lush Moapa Valley, 50 miles northeast of where Las Vegas is now. The town started as a Mormon outpost in 1865 and was later part of a chain of agricultural communities in the valley following the Muddy River, including Moapa, Logandale and Overton, that were otherwise surrounded by Orod Desert. St. Thomas had a peak population of around 500 people and for a while was known for producing cantaloupes and asparagus. A railway spur served the valley and US 991, the main highway to Los Angeles, before Interstate 15 went through town, making it a stop for motorists in 1938. However, as Lake Mead crept northward, filling in behind the Boulder Dam, St. Thomas, located at a lower elevation at the southern end of the valley, was flooded at the moment due to regional drought. Conditions. Portions of 40 buildings are visible at the exposed remains of Street Teach Thomas, including the Old School and the Hanig Ice Cream Parlor. Also visible is the foundation of the Gentry Hotel, where former President Herbert Hoover stayed in 1932 while inspecting the nearby construction project he had helped to create. The Boulder Dam, which flooded the town, was later renamed in his honor. A tiny patch of Lauderdale County that takes up less than 1 square mile is still home to about 200 people. For more than 100 years from its beginnings in 1890, Wartle was a small but bustling town on the banks of the Tennessee River, but many of its homes and buildings were moved in the late 1930s to avoid being submerged when PCK Landing Dam was built by Tennessee Valley Authority. Bainbridge was a Seabear County community submerged when Wilson Dam was built in 1924 to create Wilson Lake on the Tennessee River. It was built by Huell Cooper, but after the formation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, it was placed under its operations. Prairie Bluff, also known as Dale or Daletown, was a Wilcox County town submerged in the Alabama River. It was settled in 1819 and was largely submerged by the Denal Reservoir when the Miller Ferry Lock and Dam was constructed in 1963. Falls City was already a ghost town by the time it was flooded in 1961 after Alabama Power built a dam at the Cypee Fork tributary on the Walker River to create Lewis Smith Lake. According to the Encyclopedia of Alabama, the projected flood zone was sparsely populated, although Clear Creek Falls, actually a pair of falls about a quarter-mile apart in southeast Winston County, was a popular recreation spot for generations. Alabama Power historian Michael Snyderman wrote in the Encyclopedia article in 1853 a post office was established near the falls and a small village later known as Falls City developed, but well before the dam's construction the town dwindled, a victim mainly of its remote location. In 1953 the U.S. Postal Service abolished the Falls City post office altogether. It is unclear from historical records just how many families were displaced by the dam project. In addition to buying out residents, the company also paid to have 78 graves relocated from 4 cemeteries that were in the dam's flood zone. This isn't just a story of watery graves, it's a testament to the enduring spirit of these communities. Though silenced by the depths, their echoes still reverberate in the whispers of the wind rustling through forgotten cemeteries and the faded photographs adorning dusty mantelpieces. Their legacy lives on, its legacy that demands not just remembrance but reckoning, recognizing the uncomfortable truths woven into the fabric of American history, where progress often wore the boots of oppression. The next time you gaze upon a tranquil reservoir or bask on the shores of a shimmering lake, remember the stories that lie submerged. The whispers of lives and dreams silenced beneath the surface. Remember the 15 black towns not as victims of progress but as defiant testaments to the human spirit, reminding us that even in the deepest darkness, the embers of resilience can still glow. This brings us now to the end of this video segment. Did you learn a thing or two? Tell us what you think in the comment section below. We are always delighted to pick from your thoughts. Don't forget also to support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative. Please kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching.